Today I will finish my discussion of the Age of Reform, focusing specifically on the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. When I left off last session, we were talking about William Lloyd Garrison as one of the prominent figures in the abolitionist movement, and we talked about his anti-slavery society and his newspaper, which focused on abolitionist issues. It's important to note that Garrison was not the only person forming these anti-slavery societies and publishing anti-slavery newspapers. Many others will engage in this type of activity as a means of generating awareness for the cause. In fact, Garrison was not the first to publish or to form an anti-slavery society. The first was a guy named Benjamin Lundy. In 1815, he forms the Urban Humane or the Union Humane Society, and a few years later, he published an abolitionist newspaper called The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And Lundy was kind of the one to get it all started. Garrison came along a few years later and took things to the next level. Garrison was much more widely known than Lundy, even though Lundy was kind of the pioneer in this abolitionist movement. At any rate, the main purpose of these newspapers, like the Liberator and then Lundy's Genius of a Universal Emancipation, was to generate awareness of this issue of anti-slavery and the abolitionist movement and their goals. So we're looking at a large-scale propaganda campaign, and it's important to remember that the abolitionist movement did not contain large numbers of people. At the height of their activity, there was never more than a few thousand members of these various abolitionist societies. Around 1840 or so, there's about a little over 200 different anti-slavery societies operating in the North, whose total membership equals just a few thousand members. So we're not talking about large-scale movement here, but they are very vocal, and this is where the propaganda comes in. Despite their small numbers, they're able to actually reach a very wide audience and generate quite a bit of attention and awareness of their campaign. So a small number of people with a very loud and very wide-reaching voice. And this is due to extensive propaganda. And it's important to remember here also that most of this propaganda is aimed at the South. While they wanted to generate awareness for their cause among Northerners, there was already, even people who were not directly involved with the abolitionist movement, most people in the North generally supported the abolitionist cause. It's just like today. Pick a given cause, any given cause. A lot of people might support that cause, but they don't participate directly in it. They're not active participants in that cause. The same thing is true for the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement had very few members which participated actively in this cause, but they had widespread support throughout the North. So while they do want to maintain awareness of the issues and the cause and the goals in the North, their main target for propaganda is the South. And this is because within the South, and we haven't talked about this in detail yet, when we revisit the institution of slavery here in a few weeks, we'll get deeper into this. But it's worth noting at this point that the people who owned slaves in the South represented a relatively small minority of white Southerners. Only about 25% of the white population in the South actually owned slaves, and among that 25%, less than 5% owned large numbers of slaves, 100 or more. So the big plantations, when we think of these characteristic images of the South prior to the Civil War, these large plantations with hundreds of slaves, there were only a very small percentage of whites in the South that owned that many slaves and operated that big of an operation. Most of the slave owners in the South were smaller scale, and again, total number of whites that owned slaves was less than 25% of the Southern population. So there's a large number of people in the South that don't benefit directly from slavery. These groups are the target of the abolitionist movement. They're trying to win support from among these non-slave owning Southerners for the abolitionist cause. They figure those would be the easiest ones to sway to their side. They don't own slaves. They don't benefit from slavery. So they might very well be sympathetic to the abolitionist cause, much more likely than the large plantation owners. The large plantation owners are pretty much deaf to any kind of abolitionist propaganda. But the people at the bottom of Southern society, the non-slave owning whites, those people might be a more receptive audience. And it's this group of people that the abolitionist movement is aiming its propaganda. And we're talking about tens of thousands of pamphlets and flyers and bulletins, and these, of course, the various abolitionist newspapers. All these materials are going to be sent into the South, distributed to various groups of people in hopes of generating support among these non-slave owning whites in the South. One propagandist that is of note here is a guy named Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy was an ordained minister by profession, but in a Presbyterian church, and this is in southern Illinois in the 1830s. During the week, though, as a trade, he was a printer, a publisher. He published an abolitionist newspaper and pamphlets and so on and so forth. And what he did was his printing press he ran, generating all this abolitionist propaganda and of course distributing it in the South. And if you can think of the map, southern Illinois is just across the Ohio River from Kentucky, which of course is a slave state at this point. So Lovejoy, a Presbyterian minister and owner of a printing press that's distributing abolitionist propaganda. Other than that, Lovejoy is not really that well known. He's known locally, but he's not a pivotal figure in the abolitionist movement. He's just one of the many rank and file abolitionist members who is distributing anti-slavery propaganda. What makes Lovejoy so important is what happens to him in 1837. A mob of pro-slavery bandits basically came into Lovejoy's printing press, burned it to the ground, and murdered him. And Lovejoy, after this incident, Lovejoy will become a martyr for the abolitionist cause. Prior to this incident, he was just a regular so-and-so, not really anyone of any real importance. But after he's murdered for basically distributing propaganda, for exercising his First Amendment rights, he was killed for that. He becomes a martyr. And what a martyr does, it energizes a cause. Any cause, fighting for any type of goal will benefit from a martyr, in that a lot of times people might not pay much attention to a cause just by hearing about it, but once they find out that people are willing to die, or people are being killed just for their beliefs, this martyrdom, it helps to energize a cause. People within the abolitionist movement will become more determined to spread the word in honor of Lovejoy's sacrifice. People outside the movement will become more sympathetic because of what happens to people like Lovejoy. And he won't be the only one. There'll be others who will pay the price in terms of beatings and vandalism and some murders just for pushing forth this abolitionist cause. So nothing will energize a cause more than a martyr, and that's why Lovejoy is important. He becomes a martyr for this abolitionist movement, and that generates more enthusiasm and sympathy for the cause. All this propaganda aimed at the South is not going to go unnoticed. Now, even though the target audience of this propaganda are the people at the bottom of Southern society, the common Southerners, the non-slave owning whites, frontier farmers, that sort of thing. While they are the primary target for this propaganda campaign, the propaganda is going to gain the attention of the upper levels of Southern society, and it's from these upper levels of Southern society where we will see the most energetic response or opposition to this propaganda. So Southern governors and congressmen, Southern town mayors, and of course the big plantation owners will all respond to or try to resist this propaganda movement in various ways. And one example, this is probably one of the most dramatic examples, is that the state of Georgia offered a $5,000 reward to anyone who would bring William Lloyd Garrison to Atlanta to stand trial for sedition and rabble rousing and several other charges. But so again, we see even the state governments themselves taking an active role in trying to suppress propaganda. Another good example is that during the Jackson administration, the U.S. Postmaster General authorized local postmasters to destroy or dispose of any kind of abolitionist propaganda that was coming through the U.S. mail. And this is basically a violation of federal law. Nothing is supposed to interfere with the delivery of the U.S. mail. Anything sent in the U.S. mail is supposed to be delivered. It's a crime to willfully misdirect the U.S. mail. But here, sympathies or feelings in the South were such that local postmasters were allowed to simply remove any abolitionist propaganda, these pamphlets and newspapers and such, and just throw them away and refuse to deliver them. And of course, we will see numerous acts of vandalism and violence against abolitionist ministers and abolitionist spreaders of propaganda and so forth. It's similar to what happened to Elijah Lovejoy. Probably the biggest effort to suppress this anti-slavery propaganda is the gag rule passed by Congress in 1836. Now, what had happened by the time we get to 1836, many of the congressmen from the North had been elected by constituencies who strongly supported the abolitionist movement. So these Northern congressmen now became the voice of the abolitionist movement within the federal government. And this was of particular concern to Southerners. Propaganda being distributed through the mail and leaflets on the street and so forth is one thing, but when Congress begins discussing the possibility of abolishing slavery, this is a much more serious threat to Southern institutions than just propaganda. So Southern congressmen were able to pass this gag rule, which basically prohibited any discussion of anti-slavery legislation within Congress. So you couldn't talk about, if you're a congressman between 1836 and 1844, while this gag rule is in effect, you are not allowed to discuss the issue of slavery within Congress. So while this, on the surface, it looks like a violation of the First Amendment, technically it's not. It only applies to Congress. It does not apply to the general population. So on the street, citizens can discuss slavery and their feelings about it, pro or con, at will. They're free to discuss this openly without any fear of punishment. If you are a congressman, you can still discuss the issue of slavery, just not in Congress. So what they did, they just basically, while Congress is in session, no congressman is allowed to introduce a bill regarding slavery or to discuss the issue of slavery during sessions of Congress. What they did to help reassure the American public that their freedom of speech had not been infringed, is that anti-slavery petitions from citizens were still accepted by Congress, but Congress would not discuss them once those petitions have been accepted. So if you've got an anti-slavery petition that you get people in your district to sign this petition, and you send it off to your congressman, Congressman so and so, please, we want you to introduce a bill to end slavery, etc. Congress would acknowledge receipt of that petition. Of course, the citizen's right to petition the government is still protected here by the First Amendment. So we can send this petition off to Congress. Congress will receive it, but they won't do anything with it. They'll file it away, and it will not be discussed. So nothing in the Constitution says that Congress must discuss your petition. It just says you have the right to petition the government. So this gag rule basically eliminates the discussion of slavery within Congress. Southerners, of course, supported this universally because they didn't want to have any chance of any kind of anti-slavery legislation passing Congress. Some Northerners supported this gag rule, and this is why it was able to pass Congress. Otherwise, it would have just stalemated in the Senate. But there were enough Northern congressmen who supported this, not because they supported slavery, but because they just did not want to discuss it anymore in Congress. The topic had become such a sensitive issue, and the debate over this issue had become so bitter and antagonistic that a lot of Northern congressmen felt it's better to just not discuss it at all, because every time the subject comes up, we just end up arguing and fighting, and nothing ever happens. So we might as well not talk about it. So that's one of the reasons this gag rule is able to pass, is because there is some support for it from Northern congressmen. What ends up happening, though, is John Quincy Adams, former President John Quincy Adams, who is now serving as a congressman. Just kind of a little footnote here. You'd never see this kind of thing happening today. A former president coming back to serve as a member of Congress. But in the 1800s, this happened, not all the time, but on occasion you would see former presidents remaining active in politics even after they had served their term as president. So John Quincy Adams is going to be one of the biggest opponents of this gag rule. Adams was always a big supporter of the abolitionist movement, and this gag rule prohibiting anyone from discussing it in Congress really kind of aggravates John Quincy Adams. So he's gonna be pushing back against this the whole time it's in effect for this almost 8 years. John Quincy Adams is going to resist this, and he's very clever the way he did it. The gag rule prohibits discussion of any kind of anti-slavery legislation, but he would figure out a way to get the topic of slavery into any kind of bill. For example, Congress would be debating a new road bill, the construction of a new road. Okay, we're going to secure federal funding for the construction of a new road. Adams would get up and he would weigh in on this road bill. He would say, I think that it's important that this road be built because it'll make it easier for slaves to escape the South. He'd figure out a way to work the issue of slavery into any kind of discussion. And he did it just kind of trying to make fun of this gag rule, but also trying to keep the pressure on Congress to eventually get rid of it. And they eventually do. And like I say, in 1844, Congress will repeal this gag rule, because by the time we get to the 1840s, no one can really ignore this issue anymore. At that point, it's kind of front and center, and it's just too big to ignore. So the gag rule will eventually go away. But it represents kind of the most dramatic effort that Southerners went to in order to suppress this discussion of slavery, this anti-slavery movement. Like I said, even though the abolitionist movement never had that many actual members, just again a few thousand members that were directly involved with the movement, They did have widespread support, and their propaganda campaign had generated an enormous amount of attention and an awareness of the cause, and enough so that Southerners were genuinely concerned about the influence, the amount of influence that this movement had, and they were taking extreme measures like this gag rule, trying to suppress it. One final aspect of the abolitionist movement that we want to look at here, and this is probably one of the most important aspects of the abolitionist movement. We haven't really mentioned it up to now, but most of the prominent members of the abolitionist movement, people like Frederick Douglass, Elijah Lovejoy, and others, the revivalist ministers who were preaching an abolitionist message, they're all white men, and it seems kind of ironic that so many white people would be advocating for the end of a situation that doesn't really have a direct impact on their lives. And that's kind of how the movement started out. The abolitionist movement begins in earnest with the Quakers. They were one of the first groups to really formally speak out publicly against the institution of slavery. But as the abolitionist movement grew in numbers from the ranks of various religious groups, it was still predominantly white people that were participating in this. Blacks in the North were a minority, just like well, unlike the South, where blacks in some places were a majority. Blacks in the North were a minority, and while many did participate in the movement, most of the prominent members, the most outspoken members, were white, except for Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was one of the most prominent members of the abolitionist societies, the abolitionist movement, and he himself was a former slave. One of the reasons that Douglass is so important here is not just because he's black, and of course it's important that black voices be joining the white voices in this protest of slavery. The reason Douglass is so important, though, is that he brings an authenticity to the movement in a way that no northern white people can achieve. Douglass, having been a slave himself, he brings a first-hand perspective of this issue. When people like William Lloyd Garrison are speaking about slavery, even if people agree with him, okay, yeah, slavery is a sin, slavery is bad, we should get rid of it, etc. Most people will question, okay, while we agree with Garrison's opinions about slavery, how much does he really know about the situation? To what extent can he speak to the actual situation of slavery? He can't. He's never experienced slavery. He's never been a slave. He's never been affected or impacted by it directly. So while he is against slavery and he speaks a good message about bringing slavery to an end, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, he knows what he's talking about. His words have carry a lot more weight than those of William Lloyd Garrison. In fact, Douglass worked with Garrison for a number of years. Traveling around, they spoke together at various meetings and conventions and so forth. Douglass, having lived much of his early life as a slave, he was born into slavery and he spent most of his youth as a slave. He has experienced the realities of slavery, the harsh, brutal realities of life as a slave. He was never freed. He was actually a runaway slave. So he escaped and he ran away to the North and he joined the abolitionist movement. And when Douglass speaks, people tend to listen more carefully because they know he has experienced this firsthand. He knows what he's talking about. We can take what he says with a lot. We can take it to be a lot more. Has a lot more impact. It carries a lot more weight. We can take him a lot more seriously than we do someone like Garrison. Even though we respect Garrison and his opinions, we tend to look at Frederick Douglass as being a little bit more, having a little bit more credibility. So Douglass is an important member of this important component of this story. And Douglass is not the only black man who is participating in the abolitionist movement. Like say over the years, more and more Northern blacks will join the cause. Both former slaves and free blacks side by side will join this movement. Now, what we should note here too is that sometimes members of the black community in the North were hesitant to participate actively in the movement out of fear for reprisals, because especially if they had been a former slave, if they were a runaway slave and they had escaped, technically according to the law they're fugitives, and if they start speaking in public and participating in these rallies, they could risk someone identifying them and being recaptured and sent back to work as a slave. So a lot of times members of the black community in the North are a little bit hesitant to openly participate or speak out here because they're the fear that they could be recaptured. And this is especially the case as we get later on into the 1850s, and there's a Fugitive Slave Act in place that becomes more of a hazard for the black community in the North in terms of being captured and sent back to slavery. But Douglass here is this again is another example of his courage. He's a runaway slave. He's a fugitive. He knows this. He knows that speaking out in public is going to bring a lot of attention to himself, and that will be potentially hazardous for him in terms of potentially being recaptured or even killed. So Douglass is really committed to the cause, and he's willing to risk his life in order to generate more awareness of this important issue. Douglass himself, once he will eventually break away from Garrison's group, and he'll form a group of his own. He'll publish his own newspaper called the North Star, and this it's unlike a lot of the other abolitionist newspapers. The North Star tends to focus its message toward the black community, issues that are of concern and importance to them, and the role that they might play in this movement, trying to again generate more support for the movement within the black community. And of course, here's a picture of Douglass. This is later in life. He escaped slavery when he was 20 years old. So of course, this is many years after his escape as a slave. So he spent, I guess, the better portion of his adult life as a member of the abolitionist movement, speaking out against slavery. And most of his youth, of course, was spent as a slave. So let's talk a little bit now about the women's rights movement. One of the things that leads to this women's rights movement, in fact, well, first of all, let's do kind of a snapshot of what life was like for women in the 19th century, and this kind of gives a better idea of some of the motivations for this movement. Women in the 19th century, and of course, especially during the early 1800s, had very few, if any, rights, and we're talking mainly about legal rights. Women were considered inferior to men, and this was generally accepted. This wasn't just an American thing or a 19th century thing. This was a throughout human history thing. Very few instances or exceptions throughout human history of women achieving any kind of equality with men. From most every society throughout history since the dawn of civilization has tended to view women as inferior to men. So right off the top of the list is this perception of inferiority that women have to deal with in the 19th century. So they've already gotten all of human history working against them here. Some specific examples of women's oppression in the 19th century. No women are allowed to hold office or to vote, and this is pretty much universal throughout the nation, both in the North and the South. So we're talking about a United States thing, not just a northern or a southern issue here. This is an issue that affects all women throughout the United States. Women are not allowed to vote or hold office. Women are denied access to public education. So as far as women going to school, they'll, if there's a school in the town, young girls will be educated for the first few years. They'll learn to read and write, and beyond what would be considered today elementary school, women don't have access to education in the public sector. Now, women will be able to, some wealthy women or daughters of wealthy members of society will have access to education in terms of private tutoring and so forth, but we don't see women earning degrees or advancing through the ranks of academia in the way that we do today. Women just don't have that kind of access. Of course, there are exceptions, like say the daughters of wealthy members of society do have access to some form of higher education, but typically that's not the case. Women are kept out of professional occupations other than school teachers or nurses. You don't see women serving in any kind of professional capacity. The perception of society in general is that women's place is in the home. They serve as wives and mothers and housekeepers, and that's pretty much the limit of what society thinks is appropriate for women at this time. Basically, in terms of legal rights, women have no legal identity of their own. They are women at this time. The only identity they have is based on their relationship to a man. They're the daughter of so and so, or the mother of so and so, or the wife of so and so. Basically, in terms of a woman's identity in the 19th century, she is known only by her relationship to a man. So she has no individual public or legal identity until while she's a child, or until she's married. She is the legal responsibility of her father. Once she's married, she becomes the legal responsibility of her husband. And in many ways, women in the 19th century are, in terms of their legal status, are very similar to children today. Children under 18 today don't really have a lot of legal rights. As a minor child today, you're not allowed to sue anybody in court. You cannot be sued. In terms of crime and punishment, your punishment is less than it would be if you were an adult. You don't pay taxes as a minor child. You're not really allowed to own any property. You can't enter into contracts. Like if you wanted to go buy a car, to sign that loan for that car, you'd have to have a parent with you. You couldn't do it on your own. So we can all identify with this kind of legal status today. We at some point in our lives we were all under 18, and we experienced one or more of these things. It's one of the reasons why to participate in anything you have to get a parent's permission slip. So this is the best way we can imagine what life was like for women back in the 19th century. In terms of their legal status, they could not do anything on their own. They weren't allowed to own property. They could not sign enter into any contracts. They couldn't sue anybody in court. They couldn't be sued. If a woman was involved in some sort of an altercation, her husband or her father would be the one to answer for it, and she would not be the one to answer for it. Same thing with any kind of contracts. Now, basically, the abolitionist movement, especially since it was an outgrowth of the Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, this is an opportunity for women to participate in something outside the home, a chance to kind of break out of their traditional role and expand their role in society, at least within the limits of social propriety. So large numbers of women participating in this religious revival that's ongoing during this time period. We talked about that in the last session, how women outnumbered men more than 2 to 1 in these revival congregations in terms of new converts and so forth. The same percentages hold true within the abolitionist movement, and it seems kind of obvious since the abolitionist movement comes out of this Second Great Awakening. So we see large numbers of women participating in this abolitionist movement. They do so in various capacities. As organizers, they'll organize petitions. They'll carry petitions around and get signatures. They'll attend to a lot of the other basic tasks that are taking place within the movement, distributing propaganda and so forth, organizing meetings and things like that. So women are this abolitionist movement gives women a chance to get involved in something that is outside the scope of their traditional place in society. But even within the abolitionist movement, there's limits to what women are allowed to do as far as participation. Some conservative clergymen who were in charge of these various abolitionist societies were opposed to women participating to a certain extent. A lot of them believe that a woman's place is in the home, and she should not be here participating in this movement. She should not be certainly not be in charge of anything. So there's a lot of resistance even within the abolitionist movement toward women participating actively and openly. So this is kind of where our movement really begins. Women within the abolitionist movement begin to they see an opportunity here to participate in a larger portion of society, and they see that their attempts to engage and participate in this activity are being opposed and resisted by the male members. And it's at this point women start seeing some connections. They're in this movement, this abolitionist movement, advocating for slaves who have no rights, who have no freedom, who are completely subjugated by other members of society. Women start to think of themselves in this same way. Now, we're not trying to compare the plight of women's rights to slavery. Obviously, slaves live a much harsher and brutal life than women do at this time. But in terms of rights, legal rights, there is some comparison here. Women don't have any kind of legal status in society. Neither do slaves. So women start noticing these parallels, and they start thinking, well, maybe we should start advocating for our own rights as well, because we don't have any rights either. We are oppressed, an oppressed minority, just like the slaves. So this is kind of how the women's rights movement begins to take shape. And of course, it just didn't all of a sudden occur to them. Women had been oppressed for centuries. So the abolitionist movement is kind of a catalyst that helps get women in large groups for the first time working together toward common goals and common issues, and they start to see their own women's issues are very similar to the issues that they're fighting for in this abolitionist movement, and a women's movement seems like a natural next step in this process. Two of our first most prominent characters or figures in this women's rights story are two sisters, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. Now, the Grimke sisters had been part of the abolitionist movement for several years, all through the late 1830s. So, in fact, it's kind of ironic how they came to be part of the abolitionist movement. They are daughters of a wealthy South Carolina plantation owner. And as was common among wealthy elites, they send their children away to school for higher education. Now, among the commoners in the South and in the North too, there is no access to higher education. But if you've got a lot of money, you can pretty much do whatever you want to in terms of accessing resources for your children. And this is what their father does. Their father sends them away to college, and since there were no colleges in the South, they attend college in the North. It's here that they are exposed to the abolitionist movement. And of course, they, having witnessed slavery firsthand in the in the plantation life that they grew up in, they see a lot of these parallels, a lot of these issues. They're hearing the whole story now for the first time, and they become involved in this abolitionist movement. They develop a disdain for slavery, despite having grown up on a plantation, and they become active abolitionists. Um, In fact, Angelina Grimke will marry Theodore Dwight Weld. You remember, one of our Great Awakening revivalist ministers we talked about in the last session. So there's a very close ties to this, to the revivalist movement here and the abolitionist movement. Actually, I need to back up really quick just for a second here. Take a look at this map. This is one of our best pieces of evidence to show the connection between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. When looking at this map here, basically each of these little pie graphs represents a number of voters who signed various anti-slavery petitions that were submitted to Congress during the year 1837-1838. So each of these states, these northern states that submitted anti-slavery petitions to Congress, the pie represents the total number of voters who signed it, or total number of citizens who signed this petition. The large section represents, of course, the darker color is the female signers, and the lighter color is the male signers. And we see overall, especially in some states, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, Connecticut, we see female signers outnumbering male signers more than 2 to 1 overall in terms of all these petitions that were submitted to Congress. So we see, just in terms of numbers here, as far as people who are signing these petitions, there's a lot more women participating here than there are men. In some cases, more than 2 to 1. So that's our big connection between the abolitionist movement and the women's rights movement. And here, of course, the Grimke sisters are our best example of women who got involved with the abolitionist movement, and then later on became central figures in the women's rights movement. So they started out as anti-slavery activists, and they transformed into advocates for women's rights. They often spoke publicly to mixed audiences, both men and women, which at this time in some places was still kind of considered taboo for men and women to be gathered together in non-church settings. So a lot of people kind of look down at the Grimke sisters. Okay, what are these women doing speaking in public to begin with, to mixed audiences? And depending on what town they were in, they met with quite a bit of resistance speaking about women's rights, especially from some members of the clergy who kind of condemned them and forbade their congregation from listening to the Grimke sisters. But despite the resistance that they received, they stay the course, and they're determined to give women's rights a voice. One of the ways they do that, again, using the same strategies and tactics as the abolitionist movement, the Grimke sisters will use propaganda and essays as a way to generate awareness and support for the women's cause. They published an essay in 1840 called "Letters on the Condition of Women and the Equality of the Sexes," and this is just an essay. It's distributed in pamphlet form, and its intended purpose was to offer some kind of a coherent expression of what women's rights are all about, what women are interested in terms of their legal status and the role that they want to play in society and so forth. And this is widely circulated, generates a lot of awareness for the women's cause, and it generates a lot of enthusiasm among other women, because a lot of women, keep in mind at this time, just by the basic nature of women's lives in the 19th century, a lot of women are kind of isolated, cut off from society other than church activities. So access to this pamphlet, it's kind of it gives women who otherwise thought they were alone in their plight or their conditions. It lets them know that, okay, there's a lot of other women out there who share these same opinions and concerns, and it kind of gives them confidence to participate in this cause, that there is hope. Together we might be able to affect some sort of change. So it's an important document. In fact, for several years, this is one of the foundational documents in the women's rights movement. And of course, at least in America, this is one of the first modern statements of feminist principles. It's not the first. The women's rights movement here in America was a few years behind a parallel movement that was taking place in England, and we see a lot of that with these various social reform movements in this age of reform, the 19th century. Both the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, and several other movements will begin in England in much the same way the Industrial Revolution began in England and then later spread to America. These various social reform movements will unfold in a similar manner. So while the Grimke sisters are beginning to speak out for women's rights here in America, there's women in England who are doing the same thing. And while the English movement began a few years prior to the American movement, after a certain time they will start comparing notes. And activists in the women's rights movement will travel to England and interact with their counterparts there and share experiences, compare notes, and approach this issue as a human society issue and not just a national issue. It's not just an English issue or an American issue. It's a human society issue. And this is another thing that gives the movement more strength. It's not just a few radical women here in America speaking out against tradition. This is a movement that's taken place across international borders. Some of the things that the Grimke sisters advocate in their essay is equal pay for equal work, and this is no surprise here. When the Grimke sisters first visited the northern states in New England, they undoubtedly observed many of the women who were working in the textile industry. Remember, a couple weeks ago we talked about how most of those textile workers in those early mills in New England were women. Remember Lowell Mills? So here we have large numbers of women working outside the home, but they are not receiving equal pay for the same type of work. There were men working in textile mills too who made far higher wages than any of the women. So the Grimke sisters are saying here in their essay, if women are doing the same work as men, they should receive the same pay. Now, of course, this is a common issue today. We still hear echoes of this equal pay for equal work being voiced today. So even almost 200 years later, we see that American society is still kind of struggling with this issue. But the Grimke sisters were some of the first to really vocalize some of these things. Equal educational opportunities, and this is no big surprise that the Grimke sisters would advocate for this. Having been the beneficiaries of higher education themselves, they can readily see how this could be a benefit to all women, these educational opportunities, not just for the wealthy elite, but for the lower classes of society as well. Public education, allowing girls to continue public education on up through through the same level as their male counterparts. So these are the big ones: equal pay for equal work, equal educational opportunities. They discussed several other things too in this essay. They pointed out that men and women should be treated equally, since they're both human. And as such, they both are entitled to the same natural rights. Here they use the term natural rights. They're invoking Enlightenment ideology here, since if all people are created equally, all people have the same basic natural rights, then that includes men and women. So both men and women are morally accountable, and so therefore whatever is right for a man should also be right for a woman. So again, this is one of the first important statements of feminist principles, and it'll serve as kind of a guiding ideology for the women's rights movement in its early years. Some other, of course, just a footnote here before we get to Seneca Falls. Um, Women weren't the only ones. They weren't the only ones advocating for these rights. Some men in society advocated for this as well. People like William Lloyd Garrison. If you remember, we talked about him in our last session. He not only was an abolitionist advocating for the end of slavery, but he also advocated for racial equality, which was kind of a radical idea at the time. Well, Garrison, he further places himself on the side of radicalism by advocating for women's equality. So in the same way that he advocated for racial equality, Garrison is speaking out in support of women's equality as well. And this is kind of the last straw for a lot of the abolitionists that were part of Garrison's American Anti-Slavery Society. And it's at this point that a lot of these people will kind of quit Garrison and they will form their own anti-slavery society with a little bit less radical ideas. So again, Garrison is kind of the exception here. There were men who supported this women's rights movement, but they are kind of a minority in society at the time. And so when we get to Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848, there will be men present at Seneca Falls supporting this movement. Basically, this is one of the first major women's rights conventions in history. And I think by this point, by the 1840s, the women's rights movement in America had picked up quite a bit of momentum in terms of comparing it to their British counterparts. And this Seneca Falls is really the first large-scale convention dedicated solely to women's rights. So they're in Seneca Falls, American women's rights movement is a little bit ahead of their British counterparts at this point. Again, the purpose of this Seneca Falls Convention is to get all these advocates of women's rights together in one place to outline what their goals are. You know, women everywhere in the world have been oppressed for centuries, and this is no secret. You know, women are aware that they've been oppressed, even in the most backward places in society. Women are aware that they are not being treated equally to men. So they're not announcing anything new here. They're not coming up with anything new. Women already know that they're oppressed. The purpose of this convention is to have a discussion, a collective discussion to decide what direction they want to go in. We all the women gathered here, we know we're being oppressed, but what do we do about it? How do we go about generating support for our cause? So Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, these are the two primary figures in the women's rights movement. The Grimke sisters were more local in the New England area. Mott and Stanton they're more interstate. They're widely known throughout the North, throughout the nation. In fact, they've both have traveled and interacted with members of the English women's rights movement. So these are kind of the top voices in the women's rights movement, and they're kind of guiding this discussion at Seneca Falls in terms of outlining what their goals as a movement should be. And of course, here just a generic illustration of Seneca Falls here with Mott and Stanton speaking in front of the convention. Here's a photograph of Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony was another one of the prominent figures in the women's rights movement. This is Stanton on the left here and Anthony on the right. And this is around 1851, so this is a few years after Seneca Falls. The movement is in full swing at this point. So these figures are known throughout not just the women's rights movement, but throughout the nation and even internationally. So these names are going to be, in fact, if you ever do a course in women's studies, you're going to see Stanton and Anthony's name come up over and over again. These are the pioneers of the women's rights movement. So what are we doing at Seneca Falls? Uh, Again, our goal here is to outline some sort of coherent plan of action, goals. What do we want to achieve, and how will we go about achieving those goals? So the end result is that they draft this Declaration of Sentiments, and it's just a document outlining what women feel are the most important issues in society, and how they feel that they should be treated more equally. So that's kind of the overarching theme of this document. And they get real specific in terms of what they identify as the chief problems, and they propose solutions to those problems, and so on. First and foremost, they identify the notion of patriarchy as the chief cause of women's oppression throughout history. And patriarchy simply is a society or an organization, a system that is dominated by male leadership. The word patriot comes from the word patriarch, which is Latin for father. So a male-dominated society. And of course, this has been the case throughout history since the dawn of civilization, with very few exceptions. In a patriarchal society, just the inherent tendencies of that society leads to the oppression of women. So throughout history, the cause of women's oppression is patriarchy. This Declaration of Sentiments is suggesting that if we can get away from this notion that males somehow have this inherent right to dominate society, then only then can we get to a point where women can be free from oppression. So again, this is a big picture here. They're trying to outline what they perceive to be the chief cause of women's oppression. In the Declaration of Sentiments, they advocate for full female equality in everything. Equal pay, equal educational opportunities, equal employment opportunities. They echo a lot of what the Grimke sisters had outlined in their essay. They're just kind of putting it down into this document, which will be signed by the leaders of the movement, and this will become the official statement of women's rights during this time period. The thing that they advocate for the most is the right to vote. They want all these other things, but without the right to vote, none of these other things really has any meaning. We could get equal pay or equal opportunities, equal education, but if we don't have the right to vote, none of this is going to be that important. And of course, likewise, if we have the right to vote, then we can achieve all of these other goals. The right to vote is kind of the cornerstone of this movement. It's the most important thing. They want the right to vote. If they get the right to vote, that means their voice is going to be heard in the halls of government. When Congress sets out to make the laws that govern this nation, they will now have to listen to the voices of women as well as the voices of men. And of course, this is no big surprise that the vote is going to be so strongly fought for here. Looking at the political context of the time, we've talked about the growth of democracy in America as a whole during this time period, the early 1800s. So for the past couple of decades, women have seen democracy spreading throughout the nation. More and more men in society are obtaining the right to vote, and women see this trend, this growth of democracy, and women say, okay, we want our share of that growth too. As long as democracy is expanding, why not let it expand to include women as well? So the right to vote is going to become the kind of the cornerstone of the women's rights movement. This is what they want above all else, because with the right to vote, their voice will finally be heard. Without that right to vote, no one will ever listen to their voices. No one will ever listen to their concerns. The sad truth of it is, during the early 1800s, actually prior to the Civil War, when the women's rights movement makes very little real progress in terms of change and increased rights. There are some examples of achievement during this time period. By the time we get to the Civil War, about 14 states had granted women some or total control over their own income and their property. So if a woman is earning income in some states, and she has a right to maintain control over that income. Typically, if a married woman generates any kind of an income, it automatically belongs to her husband. Same thing if there's an unmarried woman, whatever income she earns is technically the property of her father. So some states, because of this women's rights movement, some states begin to change a little bit and give women some rights. Some states pass laws giving women joint custody over their children and the right to be sued or to sue in court. And this is important too. Keep in mind that whereas today, when a man and woman or husband and wife are divorced, you both parties have legal rights to custody of the children. In the early 19th century, this was not the case. In the case of a divorce, the children were automatically the custody of the father. The woman had no custody rights whatsoever. She couldn't even sue to obtain custody rights. So we see as a result of this women's rights movement that some states are starting to change a little bit here. And it's not nationwide. It's just individual states are starting to make accommodations for women due to their advocacy for women's rights. Legal equality, though, in terms of the right to vote, will be a long time coming. It won't be until the 19th Amendment is passed in 1920, where women will receive the legal right to vote in every state. Up until then, a few Western states and territories had offered women right to vote in the late 1800s. Places like the Wyoming and Utah and Washington Territory. This is before they were states, while they were still territories. In an attempt to motivate settlement in those territories, they would offer women the right to vote. So again, we see in some states and some territories offering the right to vote to women prior to the 19th Amendment, but by and large, most women will have to wait until that 19th Amendment is passed in 1920 to get the right to vote. In the meantime, though, women will continue to agitate for equal rights throughout the remainder of the 19th century, and this Declaration of Sentiments is kind of their handbook. This is their guidebook. So each successive generation of women's rights activists, they will look to Seneca Falls and this Declaration of Sentiments as their guide for what their goals are and how what they're working toward, what they're trying to achieve. In the meantime, though, women's rights groups will focus on other aspects of social reform, particularly in urban areas as cities grow larger in the throughout the 1800s. Women will focus on urban issues like poverty, gambling, drinking, prostitution, child labor, public education, and a lot of other related causes. So these, but pretty much everything concerning social reform will be taken up by this women's rights movement. So while they are advocating for their own rights as equal members of society, it's pretty obvious to them that that goal is going to be very slow in coming, in achieving. In the meantime, they'll focus on other little problems that they can have an impact on, and it's one of the reasons why we see so much reform taking place during the 19th century is due almost solely to the active activities of this women's rights group. That's where we're going to leave it off for today. This age of reform, it's important to remember that it continues on through the 19th century and well into the 20th century as well. So we're just looking at kind of the beginning of it here in the early 1800s.